Okay, everyone, I'm going to go ahead and get us started. Thank you for joining us. This is Tony Kubay. I'm with the USCCB and Migration and Refugee Services. Okay, it looks like folks are waiting anxiously for us to get started. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar on what you need to know for unaccompanied children. A few housekeeping items before we get started in earnest, and I introduce my colleagues who are going to be presenting today. Let's see here. We have, oh my goodness, we've had a few number of folks join us just since we started. Because of the number of people who participate in these JFI webinars, we found that it's going to be a lot easier if participants, webinar participants, type their questions in the chat box, okay? So the chat box is on the lower right-hand corner of your screen. I'm going to go ahead and type a note in there in just a minute, and then you'll see where the chat box is. And that's where you can type your questions, and then we'll get to as many questions as we can. Okay? Let me then move into the next slide. Presenting today will be Melissa Hastings, the Migration and Refugee Services Policy Advisor here at USCCB. Katie Cunin, who's the Director of Children's Services here at Migration and Refugee Services at the USCCB. And joining us later in the webinar will be Ashley Feasley, the Director of Policy at Migration and Refugee Services. With respect to the agenda, there it is on your screen. We're going to have some definitions. We're going to have a lot of information, actually, that you folks will be able to use. After today, hopefully sometime tomorrow morning at the latest, we will have this webinar, the recording and the slides that are being used. It will be available on the JFI website. Okay, so I don't want to wait any longer. Let's go ahead and get started. And here we go. Melissa, are you on the phone?
Hi, Tony. Can you hear me?
I can hear you just fine, Melissa. Go ahead. Let me turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks, everyone, so much for joining us for this primer today on unaccompanied children. So to get us started, I want to just talk for a minute about, how unaccompanied child is defined in law and who we're talking about when we refer to unaccompanied children or UC. So this is a group, again, we find the definition in statute, and it is children who are under the age of 18 who arrive to the U.S. with no lawful status and who don't have a parent or legal guardian who is immediately available to provide for their care and their custody. So I think it's important to remember that this means that children who are traveling with extended family, so maybe a child who's coming with an older sibling or a grandparent, they would still be considered unaccompanied under law, even though they are traveling with extended family. And I also want to just quickly flag, you may also hear these children referred to as UAC. That's because the official legal term of art is unaccompanied alien, and that's how it's defined in law. So you may hear that term as well. Next slide, Tony. All right, so a little bit of background then about unaccompanied child arrivals. So up until this year, you can see on the chart here on the left that the peak number of UC arrivals was in 2014, with DHS reporting a little over 68,000 unaccompanied child arrivals. But this fiscal year has been a record-breaking one in this regard. So as of August, Department of Homeland Security reported that there had been over 77,000 unaccompanied children who had arrived either at the official ports of entry or who had been apprehended in between those ports of entry along the border. So the peak in terms of numbers for this fiscal year we saw was during May, when a little over 11,800 unaccompanied kids arrived during that month. The numbers have actually dropped significantly since that time, kind of over the course of the last few months, and we saw a low during August with about 4,100 unaccompanied kids either being apprehended in between the official ports of entry or presenting themselves at those ports of entry. I will say, though, that it is expected that the number of kids could increase again this fall along seasonal trends. So that is an expectation and something that we will be watching for and could potentially see. In terms of demographics, so unaccompanied children, as you may know, are primarily from the Northern Triangle. We've seen an increase in recent years in Guatemalan youth who are arriving unaccompanied. About 30% of these children generally are female, about 70% male. And while we've certainly seen plenty of young children arriving, particularly during the zero tolerance policy when the administration was separating families in large numbers, the majority of the youth who are arriving unaccompanied do tend to be a little bit older, so primarily ages 15 through 17. Okay, next slide, Tony. Okay, so before we dig into the UC system in a little bit more detail and the roles of the agencies, I do think it's helpful to just quickly touch on our legal framework here that guides how the children are treated. And there's really three foundational pieces that I want to flag for you. So the first is the Flores Settlement Agreement, and this is an agreement that the federal government entered into in 1997 after nearly a decade of litigation over the care of immigrant children in their custody. So Flores, as you may know, applies to both accompanied and unaccompanied children, and it sets forth some really critical protections for the children's care and custody. So, for example, it requires that facilities provide children in their care with access to sanitary conditions, medical assistance, adequate supervision. It also sets forth how the children are to be released from care. And then, you know, as you may have heard, given some of the recent discussions, it also mandates that the government typically transfer immigrant children to facilities that are licensed by the relevant state for child care. Now, second here on this list that you're seeing is the Homeland Security Act of 2002. And this is key because it's where we see that definition of unaccompanied child that we just talked about a couple of slides ago. And then also it's important because it's where we find that Congress vests the responsibility for the care and custody of unaccompanied children with the Department of Health and Human Services Office of Refugee Resettlement, so with ORR. And then the third piece here is the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act, or TVPRA, and specifically the TVPRA of 2008, which is where you will find a lot of the framework for how DHS screens and refers unaccompanied children to ORR, as well as requirements related to children being placed in the least restrictive settings by HHS that are appropriate for that child, and a number of other protections, including, you know, how children can be released from care in a safe manner, and protections to ensure that's occurring, like home studies, which Katie will be talking about in a bit more detail later in our presentation. And I want to flag, we do have an existing Protections for Children backgrounder that's available up on justiceforimmigrants.org. So if you're interested in learning a bit more about these pieces, I would encourage you to take a look at that. Tony, can we go to the next slide, please? Great, thank you. Okay, so let's talk a little bit then about the role of the Department of Homeland Security, or DHS. So typically, when an unaccompanied child is encountered, it will be through DHS's Customs and Border Protection, because as you probably know, most of the children are arriving between the official ports of entry, so they're being apprehended between those official ports. CBP is then required to hold the child until he or she can be transferred to ORR care. And there are some exceptions for children from Mexico or Canada. I'm not going to go into all the detail about that here. I'm happy to take questions on that later. But I just think it's important for you to know that there are some exceptions there. Again, the majority of children we are seeing are from the Northern Triangle, though, so they would follow this standard procedure. Now, transfer under law has to occur from CBP, DHS, to ORR within 72 hours, but I think it's important to remember that there are outside factors that can affect that. So as you probably saw this past spring, you may have seen the news reports about children who are being held for prolonged periods because of the high number of arrivals and because of the fact that ORR didn't have enough bed space to accept those new children into their care immediately. And so we saw children unfortunately being held well past that 72-hour deadline. Now, I also want to flag here that unlike accompanied children who are arriving with their parents or their legal guardians, the children we're talking about are not placed into ICE family detention, and they're also not eligible for alternatives to detention through DHS. And that's under law because the custody and care is with ORR, right? But it also makes sense if you think about it from just what that would look like in terms of safety concerns that could arrive, right? If you had a young child that the DHS encountered who's alone and they were looking to put them on an ankle bracelet or release them even with case management by themselves, there would obviously be a lot of safety concerns about releasing them into the community. So instead, we have our legal framework and system that requires the child instead be transferred to ORR, which is a child welfare-focused agency. And then ORR provides for their care and ensures that the child can be safely released to a family or to a friend pending their immigration court proceedings. But again, I just wanted to stress that because I think there's been a lot of confusion, but when we're talking about child detention or we're talking about alternatives to detention or ATDs, we're not talking about the unaccompanied children population. We're talking about accompanied children who are arriving with their family. And Tony, if you could go to the next slide, please. Great, thank you. Okay, so the other critical is the role of Health and Human Services, specifically Office of Refugee Resettlement, ORR, which we've already touched on somewhat. But as I mentioned, so ORR, again, is responsible for the care and the custody of unaccompanied children, as well as overseeing the children's reunification with family or friends, also known as sponsors, while they wait for their immigration court proceedings. And part of this role is working to identify sponsors and vetting them to ensure that releasing the child to that sponsor would be safe, right? That that child wouldn't be subject to abuse, abandonment, neglect, trafficking. And of course, you know, this is a process that takes time. Sponsors, you know, as you might expect, don't necessarily get identified overnight. Vetting can't happen overnight. And also not all children have sponsors, unfortunately, available. So in the interim, ORR is caring for the children by placing them into a residential facility. And Katie is going to be going into more detail on what those facilities look like and the different levels of care. But the majority of children do get placed into permanent and state licensed facilities. I do want to quickly mention, and again, Katie's going to talk about this in more detail, but during times of high referral numbers, ORR may start to utilize temporary influx facilities. So those are facilities like Homestead, and that's to ensure that children can be quickly transferred and don't back up for prolonged periods in DHS custody. And I want to flag, very clearly that these facilities certainly are not ideal. We have been advocating for improved conditions and higher oversight standards. But they are used because they can be onboarded much more quickly than permanent facilities can be onboarded. So if you do see those high referral numbers, and ORR needs more bed space to ensure that children aren't being held in CBP holding for prolonged periods, then the influx facilities can be a very important tool, given that the alternative is a much less child-friendly space, which would be CBP holding. So I just wanted to flag that as well. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Katie to talk about the HHS system in a little bit more detail.
Katie, before we move into you, Melissa, there's a question here from Sister Sharon Altendorf. Can you speak about why the downturn in August?
Sure. I think that's a great question, and certainly, we don't have exact answers on this. I think there's probably a number of factors impacting numbers. So again, as I said, seasonal trends, it's not particularly unusual to see that the numbers will fluctuate. And as I said, in the fall, in the spring, it hasn't been unusual to see higher numbers. That being said, I think that there also it's quite possible that some of the changing policies we've seen recently could also be impacting this. I think folks have probably seen the news reports about unaccompanied children who've been turned back at ports of entry, or perhaps have been improperly caught up in some of the MPP policies. So that's certainly possible as well. But unfortunately, we don't have any one reason that we can point to.
Great. Thank you very much, Melissa. Very helpful. So, Katie, can you hear me, Katie?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. You're on.
Great, and if you could move on to the next slide. Thank you. Great, thank you so much. So I am going to share a little bit of information and a little bit more detail with regard to the HHS ORR system as it impacts unaccompanied children. And I'll start first by sharing with you some overview of the various levels of care in the ORR system. And so ORR does have a variety of placement options for unaccompanied children that they take into their care and custody. And so what will occur is, for example, DHS will contact ORR intakes when they have an unaccompanied child or unaccompanied children for placement within that 72-hour time frame. And then the ORR intakes team on their end is doing an assessment of the case to determine the most appropriate placement option for that child within their national care provider network. And so as you can see here, there are various placement options for children. The first two here on the screen are the foster care placement options. So these are fewer in terms of the availability within the ORR network. However, a child with particular vulnerabilities or particular needs may be identified immediately upon intake for placement in a foster home setting. And I'll share a little bit more about that as we move along. But briefly here, there are two types of foster care placements with the ORR system. And one is the long-term foster care, and this is the placement option for children who do not have a viable sponsor or family reunification option in the United States, but that are also seeking and pursuing immigration relief. And so those children are in care for perhaps a longer time period, residing in a home with a foster family while they seek legal relief. The second option is the transitional foster care placement, and these network or placement options are typically more short-term, and they're geared more towards younger children or very specific types of profiles of unaccompanied children. For example, some of the transitional foster homes will specifically provide services to pregnant or parenting teens or medically fragile cases or younger children under the age of 13, so that these children can be placed in a more family-friendly, community-based placement while they seek reunification with a viable sponsor. And so those are the two typical types of foster care placements in the network. In addition to that, you can see here some photos of some of the interiors of some of the permanent shelter facilities, and I'll specify these are the permanent shelter facilities in the ORR network. And that is the vast majority of the placement options within the system. In addition to that, we do have the influx shelter, and then there are some more specialized placement options within the network that are specifically to address higher level needs for children, such as therapeutic foster care, residential treatment centers, and secure or staff secure facilities. And those are all of those four are much smaller in terms of their percentage and much fewer in terms of the number of children identified and placed in those settings. And so, Tony, you can move ahead on to the next slide, which here is just to give you an idea of what some of the facilities look like within the ORR permanent shelter or permanent group home placement options for children. And so ORR really does try within these facilities to make them as child appropriate and child friendly as possible for the short period of time while the children are in care. And so in the shelter care programs and in the transitional foster care programs, the children are attending services, or rather attending school on site. So they're receiving a wide variety of services, educational, case management, medical, etc., and having all of their needs addressed in this type of a community setting where they are also given access to recreational time and other activities while working on their family reunification cases. And so HHS ORR, while they have the legal custody and placement of these children during this time frame, they are really the entity that is responsible for both the care and the custody of the child. So they're providing the shelter, the food, the clothing, meeting the basic needs, but then also as the child welfare entity within this whole system impacting unaccompanied children, the primary goal really is safe and appropriate family reunification. And so there really is, from day one when the child is placed into care, every effort being made to identify appropriate sponsors and pursue family reunification when that is a safe option for the child. And so that process starts happening immediately and is really the core of the child's case plan while working towards that reunification. And one other thing I'll just mention on this also is that there is a national network of several care provider facilities across the United States that are providing for these unaccompanied children. And there's also a level of oversight in that each of these facilities, the permanent facilities and the traditional placement facilities, are all state licensed in their respective states. And so there is a level of oversight by the Office of Refugee Resettlement, HHS, in their own monitoring and oversight and policies and procedures. In addition to that, these facilities all must comply with state licensing standards. And so that's just one important thing I wanted to mention as well. And then, Tony, if we can move along to the next slide on foster care for unaccompanied children. So, in addition to the shelter facilities, the foster care programs for unaccompanied children are certainly one of the least restrictive placement options available. Each of the foster care programs within the ORR network is required to be a licensed child welfare program in their respective state. So that is sort of going back to what we talked about earlier with the onboarding and implementation of new capacity for unaccompanied children. A foster care program must be a licensed facility before it can fully onboard and accept children for placement. And so these programs are following all of their state licensing requirements, often in line with what they would need to do for the domestic foster care program, which many also do operate. And they're providing services for children, including case management services, including ensuring children have access to all the services required by ORR while in care. And they're following ORR's policies and procedures for the unaccompanied children's program. As I mentioned earlier, the foster care programs are also being monitored annually to make sure that they are providing quality services and address any potential barriers that may come up and ensure that those programs are receiving support. And then on the next slide here, services provided in care. I touched on this a little bit earlier, but I do want to make sure that I am clearly expressing the types of services that children receive while they're in any number of placement options within the ORR network. So any child, whether he or she is placed in the permanent shelter facility, residential treatment facility, secure, or a foster home setting, they're all receiving access to the same basic minimum services provided by ORR. So when a child comes into care, he or she is connected right away with a case manager, with a clinician, with medical staff, and they are receiving those basic core services in addition to the other ones you see listed here. And so any program that onboards newly into the ORR network will need to ensure that they have the ability to provide every child with these services, including the recreational services, access to immigration legal services. That's another core one that I will emphasize here, and then ensuring that there is also access to religious services. And then on the next slide, Tony, the influx facilities. So we mentioned this a little bit earlier as well. These influx facilities have historically been used by ORR only on this temporary basis when there are very high numbers of unaccompanied children coming into care and when there is the need for that overflow capacity so that the children do not remain in the alternative, which would be CBP holding. At this time, given the low numbers that we referenced earlier today, there are no children right now being held in influx facilities, so they are vacant. However, they do remain in warm status, so there is the possibility if numbers begin to increase again this fall or in the near future that those facilities could be utilized again for overflow capacity if needed. The one very important distinction between the influx facilities and the permanent shelter facilities are that these facilities do not need to be state licensed. However, they do need to meet the ORR minimum standards. And so these facilities are expected to potentially operate again this coming fall, even within the next month, depending on the need as the number of unaccompanied children potentially may increase again. Tony, next slide, please. So children who are in care with ORR, as I mentioned, have a case manager working with them, and from day one they are working on service planning for the child to identify whether that child does have any family in the United States that could potentially come forward to sponsor him or her. And then if that individual is identified, there is a vetting process that occurs to verify the relationship with the child, to also conduct required background checks and child welfare checks if necessary. And then there is an extensive application process for family reunification. So there is a packet of information that potential sponsor would need to complete, and then that would need to be submitted to ORR for approval. And again, the goal behind this is to really ensure that as the custodian for these children, if they are approved for release, that the sponsor or individual the child is released to is safe and appropriate for the child. And so to the extent possible, that process happens relatively quickly, but with the goal of ensuring that there is some vetting and some assessment of the potential placement done. And on the next slide, Tony, some of the children who do pursue the family reunification option with a viable sponsor may be referred for additional services. So if there is a sponsor that comes forward, but there are potential concerns about the placement, that case might be referred for a home study prior to release approval and or potentially post-release services following the reunification. So cases where there may be a particular concern, or in other cases a child may have very unique needs, such as a medical needs or mental health needs, or something identified that would require some additional support post-release, those cases would be referred and would receive some additional support from a community-based provider to ensure that both child and family are supported in that placement so that it will remain strong and positive and productive. And so as children are being approved by ORR for release to sponsors, those children receiving family reunification or post-release services are receiving assistance with a variety of things, general case management services, but also linkage to community-based resources to support school enrollment, ensure that they have access to an immigration attorney to pursue their legal case, access to low or free medical services in the community, mental health services, and one other key piece is education on the immigration court process. So a variety of resources and supports are provided to children, although I will flag that only a relatively small percentage of children are receiving these ORR-funded post-release services at this time. Those that do and that we're able to monitor and track have shown that these services have been very impactful in supporting the child and family post-reunification. And so I will leave it there for now and happy to ask or take any questions on anything that I've covered so far, or we can move along.
My goodness, Katie, you provided so much information, and it speaks to what you were presenting, as well as the compassion the folks on this webinar feel for kids. There are a number of questions here. There's one. Okay. We see on. Wait, no, that's not it. Let's see here. There's an instance here where there's a question here. I'm trying to get back to it.
Tony, while you look for that question, this is Melissa.
Yeah, go ahead.
There was a couple really good ones that were flagged that I just want to highlight up because I think they're great questions, and I'm sure others on the webinar were also wondering. So we got one question about why OR is not creating more licensed bed space, so permanent facility bed space, rather than using influx facilities. It's a really great question. And so I do want to reiterate that OR is working to expand its permanent bed space. That is also something that we are continuing to advocate for, so I think it's a great ask. As we'll be talking about in more detail in a few minutes, but they are working to expand that permanent bed space. The piece that's important to remember is that the permanent bed space has to be licensed, and that licensing process can take many months. Sometimes it depends on the state, and even take up to a year in some instances. And so if there is an immediate need, so if you have an unexpected increase in children who are arriving at the border and being referred into care, and there's an immediate need for more bed space, even if OR is working to bring online those permanent facilities, it's not going to be a quick fix for them, right? It's not going to be kind of an ability for them to be able to emergency respond, which is why the influx facilities have traditionally for years been utilized in those kinds of cases, because since they're not going through that licensing process, they can be onboarded much more quickly. Now, again, I want to be clear that what we've been advocating for, however, is that those facilities really only be utilized in that truly emergency response scenario, and that they not be left online for longer periods of time. But I just thought that was a really great question, and I wanted to flag that for folks.
Thank you, Melissa. Katie, the question is, are these kids being transported across the country according to availability? And I'm assuming that's availability of space.
Yes, great question, and that is generally correct. And so when there is a child or multiple children in need of placement, ORR sort of has a centralized intake process. So they're receiving those calls from DHS, from CBP, and they're identifying where they have an open bed for that child, and also at the same time looking at what the child's needs are to determine which level of placement that child needs and what the availability is. And so that's absolutely correct. And while the majority of the permanent bed facilities are along the southern or southwestern areas of the United States, we're seeing more and more opening in different locations really across the country. And so those children will be transported by DHS to the location where there is capacity available. At that point, the ORR facility staff will receive the child and conduct the formal intake.
Katie, one more question, and I think we can move on. Sister Sharon Altadorf is asking the question: why might the need increase again in October?
So that is also a great question, and I think Melissa touched on this perhaps a little bit earlier. We really don't know for sure, but there is the general thinking that aligned with historical migration trends, we do expect a possible increase this fall. That is one factor, certainly, that typically in the fall we do see the numbers start to tick upwards with regards to unaccompanied children. And so that's really the bigger factor there. And so we're preparing for that. ORR is preparing for that, again, with the goal that more permanent bed space can be available, but we do expect those numbers to increase.
Great. Okay. Thank you. Lots of very good questions. Thank you, folks, for asking them. If you folks have any other questions, please type them in the chat box here. And
Tony, this is Melissa. I saw another follow-up question came in on the influx facilities. So if you don't mind, before we move on, I'd like to just address that one too, because it's another good question around whether or not, instead of using influx facilities, could OR just hire more staff in order to release the children more quickly. So this is another really good question, and essentially, we have seen in the past that there have been policies, and we'll be talking about them in more detail in a few minutes, but that have delayed reunification. So that would be most notably an information sharing agreement between OR and DHS that had a chilling effect on sponsors coming forward. It's also known as the MOA. We've been doing ongoing advocacy to try to make sure that's rescinded. But in terms of just hiring more staff, or trying to speed up the release, and Katie can probably speak to this in much more detail, but I think it's a little bit of a tricky situation because it's not just on ORR's side, right? It's also working with the child to identify the sponsor. It's making sure that the sponsor's coming forward and filling out all the applications and the paperwork that they need to fill out. It's going through that vetting process. And if there's additional checks that need to be made to make sure that it can be a safe release, you don't want to skip those checks, right? We want to make sure that the reunifications are occurring as quickly as can safely be made possible. And I think that safely piece is really important. So I think that's just something I wanted to highlight. And Katie, I don't know if you have anything to add there.
Yeah, certainly. And to add on to that, we do, having worked on the program side with unaccompanied children for several years, we have seen situations where children have been potentially unsafe sponsors, rather, have been identified during the home study process and ruled out. Additionally, there are certainly cases we've seen where a release was approved and perhaps rushed too quickly, and the safety of the placement was not fully vetted, and those are cases that then pop up on the back end where the child is in an unsafe situation. With the information sharing that came out last year, we were also particularly concerned about the possibility of less qualified sponsors perhaps coming forward in place of the biological parents. And so we really want to also make sure that we're balancing the efforts to ensure a timely release with the safety of the child, and knowing that not everyone who comes forward to sponsor a child always has that child's best interests in mind.
Great. Very good. We have a few more questions that have come in, but I think we need to move on, and we'll get to these questions. We have a few more slides to go, so I'll let Melissa and Katie catch their breath. Ashley, can you hear me? You might need to press *1 to unmute your phone. Ashley, you may need to press *1 to unmute your phone. So how about this? While Ashley is joining us, can we take one more question, Melissa and Katie, if that's okay with you?
Sure.
Okay. Great question from our partner, Sharon Stanley Ray. Why do we see some cases where HHS has been awarded contracts for millions of dollars to open centers even before they're qualified to offer care? Shouldn't they be qualified according to licensing standards before funds are awarded?
Katie, do you want to start with this one?
I'm sorry, I was on mute. Yes, so the question is why, whether HHS is awarded millions of dollars for contracts to open centers even before they're qualified to open care according to state licensing standards. And I think this perhaps, if I'm understanding the question correctly, ties back to the fact that oftentimes the licensing process for the permanent bed facilities does take some time, and it can take, an average of 3 months is what we're seeing for state licensing to approve a new facility. And so oftentimes some of the contracts for the larger influx facilities may be a quicker in terms of timeline for that to come through. I don't know if that addresses your question exactly, but I think it is a time frame issue with regards to the licensing requirements.
Great, thank you. And then Ashley, you may need to press *1 to unmute your phone.
And Tony, if you go to the next slide, this is Melissa. I'm happy to get started since I know we've only got a few minutes left while Ashley deals with these technical difficulties.
Yeah, there you go. Go ahead, Melissa.
Okay, great. Thank you. So thank you for everyone for those great questions. Those were really wonderful. And hopefully we'll have a couple more minutes here at the end to take some more of your questions. But we did want to spend a few minutes talking about some of our recent advocacy on the UC issues, as well as some of the asks that we've been making recently. We get a lot of questions around this. So in terms of recent advocacy efforts, obviously this is an area where we've been seeing a lot of movement. I've highlighted some of them here. So obviously the appropriations has been a major effort of ours. We spent a lot of attention on the FY19 supplemental and the FY20 Labor, Health, and Human Services appropriations bills. And we were very pleased to see that some of the language that got included on preference for community-based care, so that's, the foster care and the small group homes we were talking about, as well as small-scale shelters. So preferencing that, language around increased funding for post-release services around that family reunification piece, as well as in the House FY20 bill, we were also really pleased to see some of the language we were advocating for around increased standards and heightened oversight of influx facilities was included. So that was really positive, and I've included some of our letters and links to our letters there on the slide if you're interested in taking a look. Other recent efforts, of course, include opposition to the Graham bill, which would roll back many of the existing protections for unaccompanied kids, as well as for asylum seekers. You can see our letter of opposition there. That's something we'll be monitoring as well this month if it comes back up in the Senate. And then also have been working with certain offices on possible legislation and language, again, to improve and increase standards and oversight for the influx facilities. And then a few other pieces that I want to highlight here are our comments on the Flores rule, which, as you saw or may have seen, was recently finalized, as well as our statement in opposition. This is a really major change that would roll back protections for kids that were found at Flores Settlement Agreement of 1997, and we're very concerned with that. And as you may know, that's it's the subject of litigation right now, so we're hoping that that rule will be halted, but that's something we've been continuing to work on, as well as I mentioned a few minutes ago that information sharing agreement between ORR and DHS on sponsors and household members' information, and that's something that we've been working on since it was released, trying to get that that information sharing agreement rescinded. So I've included links there to some of our recent efforts, and I'm going to pause for a second to see, Ashley, are you on?
Ashley, you may need to press *1 to unmute your phone. I think you're a presenter. Or maybe your phone is muted on your desk, Ashley.
Okay, so I'm going to keep going here then and talk a little bit about our asks. So these, and again, happy to go into more detail on any of these, but these are some of the recent asks we've been making. So of course, I think, you know, as a foundational piece is addressing the root causes of migration for these unaccompanied kids. We always want to include that given some of the violence that we know that these children are facing in their home countries, and the fact that they should be able to live safely in their home countries. So that's a piece that we continue to advocate on. But then, as I mentioned just a minute ago, also for those children that are forced to flee and find themselves in the OR system, you know, really ensuring that there's a prioritization for the use of the community-based residential care. So again, small group homes, foster homes, as well as the small-scale shelters. Also, expanding use of the family reunification services that Katie was talking about. So wanting to make sure that more children receive home studies, so that initial screening to make sure that their placements are going to be safe placements, as well as the post-release services, the PRS, to make sure that the children are being connected to community resources, that they're getting that legal referral. As Katie said, unfortunately, the majority of children are not getting these services that are so critical, and so that's been another traditional ask of ours. As I mentioned, continuing to encourage introduction of legislation to improve standards at the influx facilities, and then again also continuing to rescind, encourage that the MOA, that information sharing agreement, be rescinded. So those are some of our recent asks, and Tony, if you go to the next slide, please. Great. So we wanted to wrap up with just talking a few minutes about what you can do. And so the first, of course, is to learn more about this issue. We would encourage you, if you haven't already taken a look at some of our more detailed resources, to go ahead and take a look at those, and please feel free to share them with your networks if you're getting questions on this issue. I've included over to the right there a list. This is not even all of our resources, but there's some of the ones that are on the topics we touched on today. And I do want to flag a new resource is that Settings of Care Backgrounder that you see as the fourth bullet there on the right. So that touches on what Katie was talking about today. We've gotten a lot of questions around the different levels of care in ORR for unaccompanied children. So I would encourage you to take a look at that new resource. And then also our influx facility backgrounder was just updated as well, so you can take a look at that. Secondly, and incredibly importantly, would encourage you to reach out to your members of Congress as you have conversations with them to express your support for unaccompanied children, and really ask them to make sure that they're maintaining the existing protections for unaccompanied children. We've seen both, of course, on the administrative front, but then also in legislation this Congress, that there have been efforts to roll back particularly the Flores protections and the TVPRA protections that we were talking about at the beginning of this webinar. And so asking them to oppose that and to reject any such efforts or legislation, I think is going to be really important. And we have some backgrounders, and I'm happy to take any questions around that piece. And then finally, and Katie can probably talk about this in a little bit more detail, but if you or others in your network are interested in becoming a foster parent, I've included a link there where you can get more information and you can reach out to us, but would also encourage you to consider that. And Katie, I don't know if you have anything you want to add on the becoming a foster parent piece.
Certainly. As Melissa mentioned, please do reach out to that email address provided on the slide in front of you if you are interested in learning more about becoming a foster parent. We will make every effort on the program side with our team here to connect you to one of the foster care programs within our national network based on your location. so that that process could be started, and you can have some additional information about where those programs are located and what the process looks like for becoming a foster parent for an unaccompanied child.
Great. Thank you, Melissa and Katie. Let's see here. There's a question from Sharon Stanley Ray on restating the potential ending of the Flores protections and how they could impact unaccompanied children in shelters. Can one of you take that, Melissa or Katie?
Yeah, sorry, Tony. Can you repeat the question, please?
Sure. Can you please restate how the potential ending of the Flores protections could potentially impact unaccompanied children in shelters?
Sure. Great question. So obviously the Flores rule had a number of really significant implications. I want to be clear, it has not yet been implemented. The final rule has dropped, but the implementation date is not till October, and it is being litigated. So the largest of the changes actually impacts accompanied children. That being said, and I can speak to it in a second, that there are also changes impacting unaccompanied kids. But one of the most major changes in the Flores rule is around the licensing scheme for family detention facilities. And so essentially, as we talked about, children, both unaccompanied and accompanied, typically have to be held in licensed facilities. And as you probably know, the family detention facilities are not state licensed for child care. And so one of the major changes the rule is making is saying that they can set up a separate system for licensing those family detention facilities. And of course, our concerns are that those are not going to be the same standards that those facilities would have to meet if they went through the normal state licensing process. Now, there are also other changes, including changes to age determinations, changes to the bond processes, changes to also, there's an emergency exception that allows facilities, both DHS and HHS, to basically have an exemption from some of the Flores protections during cases of emergencies, and it's broadening that exception. I would encourage you to take a look at our backgrounder that we just put out on this. It's 10 things you should know about the recent Flores rule, and it goes into it in a little bit more detail, and it's available on justiceforimmigrants.org. But I would also be happy, Sharon, to talk to you in more detail offline about this.
Thank you, Melissa. It looks like we have a few more minutes for questions, if folks have them. Melissa and Katie are our resident experts on this issue. So for folks, if you have any more questions, please do type them in the chat box. There's a question here from Sue Weischer. What's the likelihood that the federal district court judge who oversees the Flores agreement, so Judge G, would approve the changes proposed by the Trump administration regarding the Flores agreements?
A great question, Sue. Obviously, I don't have a crystal ball, so I say this with a caveat. I think that many of us would be very surprised, if Judge G found that the rule that was just dropped was sufficient. So I think there's an expectation from many that it will likely get balked by Judge G. That being said, of course, we don't know for sure what will happen or what will happen on appeal. So it's something that we're going to be watching. They're in the middle. They've done some of the briefing on it, and we're expecting a decision hopefully before that October 22nd date when the rule's likely to go into effect.
Thank you, Melissa. Yeah, that was a great question, Sue. Folks, we have another couple of minutes. If there are any other questions, please go ahead and type them in the chat box. And Melissa, I had to step out. Melissa, Katie, I had to step out for a moment. Did we get to this question from Sharon about the best ways the faith community can work together?
Sorry, Tony, what was the question?
It's from Sharon Stanley Ray. She had a question about the best ways the faith community can work together to make sure that the MOA and the information sharing requirements can be rescinded.
Sure, that's a great question. So I will first say I would encourage you, if you haven't already, to take a look at our MOA backgrounder. It provides more detail. So we've been monitoring, as I said, we've been monitoring this policy, and we're continuing to call for it to be rescinded. ORR has taken some steps to walk it back somewhat. So we saw initially in December and then in March and June, they've walked back exactly who is having information shared about them. So for example, one of the categories is that with the exception of certain individuals that are particularly kind of considered at-risk cases, most parents are not having their information shared. That being said, we understand there's a lot of confusion. There's still some individuals who are being impacted by the policy. We do want to encourage it be rescinded, and we are continuing to encourage that happen both through the appropriations process. We saw language included in the House FY20 bill. So that's a piece, as well as generally encouraging your members of Congress to, first educate them about this and then encourage them to speak out against that policy as well. And you can find some of our specific asks on that MOA backgrounder, but happy to also connect more offline about that as well.
And then there's, I think we have time for one more question. Someone's asking for a clarification. Are we advocating for increased ORR staff to help with processing, keeping in mind the safety issues, of course?
Sure, that's a great question. So we have not specifically advocated for an increase in ORR staff. We've been advocating for an increase in the permanent facilities, specifically the community-based residential care and the foster care. So that's how we've approached that issue. And then, of course, advocating, as I said, for the policies that we know have delayed reunification. I think we don't have necessarily enough information to know or have an indication that it's an OR staff level issue that would be delaying any of the reunification or anything like that. So that's why we haven't necessarily taken that approach yet.
Very good. Thank you, Melissa. Thank you, Katie. Thank you, everyone. We're coming up on the top of the hour here. Thank you, everyone, for joining us on this webinar today. I do want to express my appreciation to my colleagues here at MRS one more time. Melissa Hastings, the policy advisor, immigration policy advisor at Migration and Refugee Services, and Katie Cunin, who is the director of Children's Services here at USCCB, Migration and Refugee Services. Folks, this webinar is going to be posted on the Justice for Immigrants website. We just need a little bit of time to upload it and make sure the recording is in proper order. But you can look for it hopefully tomorrow afternoon at this time on the JFI webinar site. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for your interest and for your support. We will talk to you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.